thank you so much for being here. I'm really grateful to see a full house, there are just incredible treasures outside. So the fact that you're willing to take an hour to sit in a small room and be away from those things is really wonderful. As she mentioned, this is the thrill of the chase. We're going to be talking about how collectors, institutions, dealers seek out the material, seek out the treasures that we see on the walls outside. It was partially inspired by thinking about some of the great dealers of the past, someone like Joseph Devine. So I thought I would just start with one quote from a New Yorker profile of Sir Joseph Devine, of course, the spectacular early 20th century art dealer. S.N. Behrman wrote, "He deployed runners all over Europe to hunt out noblemen on the verge of settling for solvency and a bit of loose change at the sacrifice of some of their family portraits. These reports that he received might include the gossip of servants who had overheard the master saying to an important art dealer, as they savored the bouquet of an after-dinner brandy, that he might, in certain circumstances, he just might consider parting with the lovely titled Gainsborough lady, smiling graciously down at them from over a mantle." Of course, we live in a very different time now, where there might be spies among us, there might be spies sent out to country homes, but we have the internet, we have just incredibly robust databases of art. So how do you find these incredible works that are going to speak to your passions? And that's why I'm delighted to be joined by three people who work on this from quite different perspectives, but all are after the same goals in some way. To my right, I have Megan Fox Kelly, who is the principal of Megan Fox Kelly Art Advisory. She's been a leading art advisor for over 25 years, providing curatorial and market advice and museum-quality fine art services for collectors, foundations, and estates. She is the former president of the Association of Professional Art Advisors. She held that role for 3 terms for 6 years, and she draws on her foundation in museum practices and curatorial work in 20th century and contemporary art to serve her clients. She began her career at the National Gallery of Art. Next to her, we have Will Elliott, who I'm very grateful for. Getting a dealer away from his stand during a fair is a risky business, but he was gracious enough to be here. He's the founder of Elliott Fine Art, which is a dealership focused on early 19th century to mid-20th century paintings and works on paper. And he aims to reevaluate forgotten masters, as well as recontextualize major names. In 2022, he forged a partnership with Kolnagi called Kolnagi Elliott Master Drawings. They're at booth 613. It is right by the bar north, where they have just the remarkable pastry cabinet. So you can have a pastry visit with him. Next to him, we have Jacques Schumacher, the senior provenance research curator at the Victoria and Albert Museum in London, which is a position supported by the Polanski Foundation. At the V&A, he is responsible for research in the history of its collections, and he's the author of a forthcoming book from University College London Press. It will come out in June, and it is titled Nazi-Era Provenance of Museum Collections, a Research Guide. So without further ado, I've talked too much. I want to delve right into it. And Megan, I'll direct just the first question to you, which is, when you're working with clients, how do you go about discovering the material, going on the hunt for things that they want? Where does it begin?
It begins with what they want, right? And every single client is different. Every single collector is different in terms of both their interest, their tolerance for risk, what their goals are, what they like, And every collector will say, well, I just buy what I like. Well, you do. But there's so many more layers, within that. And then, whether I'm starting with somebody who's very new to collecting and has nearly nothing, or somebody who has a collection, they're looking to refine it. There are ways of having those conversations and finding out, what is the next thing that they want.
Yeah.
And often there are the things that they have always been looking for, and we sort of start with that and build around it.
Yeah, yeah. And what are the sort of questions you're asking them to kind of tease out their tastes and their interests and then begin that hunt for the material?
It's a good question. A lot of times I don't have to ask the question because all you have to do is get them in front of their collection or in their home, and they start immediately talking about the things that they've bought, the things that they haven't bought. The one that got away, that's one of my favorite stories, and we'll get to that, I think, later, the one that got away. And really it's more listening than asking the questions. How do they look? Are they, quick about making decisions? Are they the kind of collector who really get fascinated with, getting into the minutia of the object, not only its quality, but, into, the provenance, the story behind it, the narrative behind it? What is the thing, the hook that gets them thrilled?
Yeah, fantastic. And Will, I would direct a similar question to you, coming from sort of the opposite side of this equation, sourcing material, finding great things to offer Megan's clients. How does one go about doing that in this day and age?
Well, there's a few different ways of doing it. Of course, I think, as you alluded to, a lot starts online now. So as a dealer, there's different ways to source. You can source privately, which is one way, which I do sometimes, but I love looking at auctions. So how I source the majority of my material is just trawling through provincial auction houses all across the world, which takes a lot of time, but I find it quite therapeutic in a funny sort of way. And what I love about it is you're trawling through, and to be open about it, rubbish, but then something just jumps out and grabs you, and you get that frisson of excitement. So for me, when I'm looking for something, it's got to be something visually that I love. That's the starting point. Of course, as a dealer, you're interested in things beyond that. What's capturing the zeitgeist? What's the context of this work? But the starting point is always, do I love it from an aesthetic point of view? And then, of course, if that is the case, often once you've bought it and you do the research, a great story reveals itself, and you really dive into the contextual side of things. But yeah, just in a very normal case, I source by looking at online auctions.
Is there one example you could share, maybe that you've seen and said, "Ooh, like this is something where maybe I have an angle on this"?
Well, I suppose, again, to put it in a nutshell, in the current climate, the woman artist angle is obviously very much in the zeitgeist. So as a dealer, your antennae, of course, picks up when you find a work by, in my case, a woman artist that often I've never heard of, and you see something which is exceptionally good quality. And of course, the fact that it's woman makes it more interesting, broadly speaking, to museums. But of course, the quality's got to be there as a starting point. So that's always the foundation, whatever the period, whatever the style of work, is it great quality? But often, you find things which you didn't know existed, but sometimes you find things which you've sort of been looking for your whole life almost, and then they pop up, and that's the most exciting, I think.
Wow. And Jacques, I'm especially excited to have you here because I think for many people in the audience, they may be somewhat less familiar with the sort of work you do. Because essentially you are doing this undergirding research to make these acquisitions happen, to check things that have been acquired. And so I'll direct the same question toward you, but also if you could sort of just speak to the work you do.
Yes. So I approach it from a completely different perspective. I'm a curator, but I'm not a curator who goes out to a fair and then decides that an object should come to the museum. And I enter the picture after others have decided that the item should come to the museum. And provenance has, of course, always been important because of prestigious collectors and so on. But I look at it from a slightly different angle. I look at it to identify potential problems with an item. So provenance cannot be only fantastic and prompt an object that would otherwise maybe not as significant to justify an inclusion in a museum collection. It can lead to it coming to a museum. But if there's a problem with the provenance, it could also prevent it from entering a public collection, for example. So what I do is I do a lot of archival research, a lot of compliance checks, and I try to reconstruct the history of ownership. Not just the career highlights, prestigious collections, but I try to reconstruct an unbroken chain of ownership.
And without getting too into the weeds here, could you talk a little bit about how that research works, the sort of databases you use, and how that's maybe changed over time?
Yes, there is a real problem here because it's not like doing a PhD where you have an unlimited amount of time essentially or several years. Usually there's a lot of time pressure involved. An object might come up for auction. You have several days to decide if you should acquire it. You have to probably don't have time to go to archives. So database checks are very important. They are publicly accessible databases, but also commercial due diligence providers. If there's a bit more time, if an object is in a private collection, there's a lot of archival research. But it's essentially, if you think about it, it's not a box-ticking exercise, due diligence. It's about applied common sense when it comes to thinking about the risks associated with an object and identifying relevant archival materials and clearly understanding what we know and what we don't know about the objects.
Yeah, yeah. It's fascinating work. I want us to sort of now, I'll toss this question out to the group to just think historically a little bit about the hunt for great pictures, the hunt for art. Of course, we have the story of Devine having kind of spies out. We think of stories like Larry Gagosian, sneaking into back rooms of people's houses to take Polaroids of artworks to source. The internet, of course, has changed things in the way that we can go about acquiring work. So a question I would toss to the group is how that has changed over time in your career, and where you see things perhaps going in seeking out material.
It has changed because of the internet, obviously. I mean, Will can go to the internet instead of, trying to, chase after every, printed, auction catalog from a small, local gallery. But the internet also makes things more competitive.
Yes. Right,
because it's very democratic. Everybody can look at it. Everybody can see it. Everybody can get that information. So if the thing you're looking for is more elusive, right?
Yeah.
Either you see it and there are 500 other people who also have seen it, or thousands of people who have also seen it, or you have to source it in different ways. And so if the object of my collector's desire is more elusive, I really am doing it the old-fashioned way, which makes me sound like a geezer, but it's the truth. You have to kind of go back and do it the way that it was before the internet.
Yeah.
So looking in a catalog raisonné and saying, how many of these objects are in private hands, if there is a catalog raisonné?
Yes.
And where are they? And are they still there?
It's old-fashioned.
And can we make friends? And do we, so much of it is about relationships. So I think that's the other old-fashioned part of it. It's research and it's relationships. So going to a curator who might know, that collector, going to a dealer who might have a relationship with that collector and saying, look, I have a client who's interested. If it ever comes loose, I hope you'd call us, right? Yeah. And being a good collector, right? The kind of collector that dealer wants to call, as opposed to, oh, well, that guy's going to buy it and he's going to flip it 6 months later, right? And so I'm not going to, waste getting that picture for him. But being that collector that is going to have done his or her homework and is going to, pay for the piece, and it's going to be a simple, not drawn out transaction. So I think it's both.
Yeah, yeah. So what I hear you saying is there are maybe some new tools, but essentially it's relationships. It's doing the work.
And research.
Yeah,
exactly.
Will, how about for you? For the
Well, it's interesting for me because I've been dealing independently for 4 years, and I've been in the art market for maybe a decade. So for me, the internet has always been the cornerstone of how you source things. So a lot of dealers of older generations lament the old days of the 80s and 90s when you could find things with very little competition. But as Megan says, of course, there are pros and cons. It means I have access to many more things than a dealer would have done in the 80s, where you would have to be looking through printed catalogs, or you were just lucky and you happened to be at that sale on that day and got that masterpiece. So I think dealers just have to evolve and adapt. But as you alluded to at the beginning, Devine and runners, there are still people out there across the globe, I wouldn't say being spies, but accessing private collections, which a dealer might not be able to access to because they just don't have the contact, and they will bring a work to a dealer. And there's this whole ecosystem of dealers and runners who operate at all echelons of the art market. So that is really how it was back in Devine's day, but that still exists to a certain level. Although, as I say, for me, I just love the sort of, the thrill of scouring for things online.
Yes, no, same. And I'm glad, Megan, that you brought up the competitive aspect of this. I mean, it just strikes me that now, so one of my addictions is posters by German artists from the 80s for their exhibitions. And it's just so frightening to know that when I'm bidding on one of these things, dozens of people probably have an alert set for the similar thing. I'm going head to head with the whole world. And in that universe, for low market things or high market things, how does a collector become competitive? How do you win out when information transparency is so much clearer?
Wow, that's a good question. Well, if it's auction, you win out because you've done your homework, you've made your decision, you want it, and you're willing to pay the most.
You spend the money.
Right.
Yeah.
You just spend the money.
Yeah.
There's always some upper limit, though. There's always like one line at which they're not going to cross. But again, going back to the thing that isn't coming up at auction, that you're not sitting there, and this is such a good point you brought up, Will, that you used to have to be at the auction, right, or be maybe on the phone at the auction in some far-flung place to do it. Now you could just be sitting there doing click, click, click with so many of the different auctions. That being said, if it's something that's private, it's again knowing when that thing might come up. Being the Duveen who goes into Lord somebody's house and gets that portrait off the wall. It's not unlike that.
And so as a collector, it's finding the right people to deal with. It's finding an advisor who can access that.
Right.
Also, because I think the thrill of the chase can also almost be too intoxicating in that sometimes in these smaller auctions, there's this sense of discovery which makes people get very carried away. And so whether you're a private buyer or a dealer, I think you have to retain a certain discipline. I've seen things in small auctions which, come up at ridiculously low estimates, but then sell for prices maybe 2 or 3 times they would make at a major international auction house, because people just get so wrapped up into this idea of finding a hidden gem sort of in a corner somewhere. So I think you have to be disciplined. Of course, this is a totally different conversation, pricing. If you love something, you love something, and then what is the correct price for it? But I think it's important not to get too carried away, as you often can do when you discover that remarkable thing.
Yeah. So mistakes can be made.
Yes.
In the moment.
They can be.
And so speak to professionals.
Yes.
And that maybe is a perfect segue to bring Jacques back in here, because I thought we could talk about. When you go out to the fair and you see these remarkable things, and we know that the dealers here have been vetted so thoroughly. We know that this is material that's been very carefully picked. But if I'm in a smaller place, if I'm in an auction house, I'm new to the game, or even I'm experienced. We hear tales of collectors being taken in. How does one begin to research and establish that I'm comfortable buying this thing?
That's a very good question. And what I would say is it's important to think about this as early on as possible, because if you don't do it, I don't want to create panic, but the risks that are involved if you're a collector or a museum and you buy something that you should not have bought is that you potentially lose the object if you have to restitute it, you lose the money, you won't get it back, and you lose your reputation in the process. And I think we can all think of collectors who for decades were very well regarded, whose reputation has become tarnished because of certain acquisitions. So there are very good reasons for looking at this early on, not just to minimize these risks, but also if you're a collector and you want to sell the item one day, it's very good to have a provenance record to keep all of the relevant paperwork. And if you, like most collectors, you want to see your objects one day in a museum, ideally in a gallery with your name in it, museums are going to ask these questions. And what I would say, depending on the type of object, it really depends. There are some obvious databases that one can check. But my experience is collectors are interested in the objects. They want to know the full story, not just from a problem and compliance perspective, but they're interested in the collectors who owned them before. So research into the object and research that is backed up by documentary evidence, I would say, is very important. And your question was about also about the gaining a competitive edge. Just keeping paperwork and meticulous record keeping, I would say, gives a lot of collectors a competitive edge in an environment where most collectors are, of course, just fascinated by the objects, right? And then that's it. But if you keep the paperwork, if you record your thinking about the object, I think that is a real competitive advantage.
Oh, that's interesting.
I think it's about expertise too. I mean, as Will was saying, as he's looking through, catalogs, he sees something of quality and it jumps out, right? And then it's the expertise that drills into, the provenance, the condition of the object, how many other objects are like this, where does this one stack relative to others, and then the price research. And I was thinking about that when I was walking around the fair yesterday and Thursday. And, I'm looking at things that, I recognize or I know what it is, and my head is clicking, it's such and such a date, and it's probably XYZ price, right? Things that I know. And then I'm looking at so many things that I know nothing about.
Yeah.
Antiquities and Asian art and a lot of old masters that, I've never heard of. And if I had a client who was interested in something outside of my field, which happens with great frequency, part of my job is not to say like, oh, sure, I'm an expert in everything. And there are art advisors who do. I mean, I'm sorry to say, but there are.
Yeah.
Who is the person, the dealer or the auction house specialist, the curator, the researcher, the scholar, the writer, the whatever, who's going to be able to help us do that expert research?
Yes.
Right, so part of my job is accessing the best research, not depending just on me.
Yes.
Because that's a real disservice to a client.
Yeah.
And so again, relationships, knowing who to call to get to that person to get those answers.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I'm glad you bring that up. I mean, that really is the joy of being here in Maastricht, right? It's just having this incredible variety and just being willing to admit, like,
right.
I
know
don't
nothing.
This.
Yeah, I don't know anything.
Yeah. And then to be here with the masters who can kind of teach you the criteria, teach you how to go about doing this. To talk about problems, to focus on this and kind of hone down in on it. Jacques, I'm curious, I mean, if someone brings a work to the museum, they're interested in donating, and you establish that this is something that cannot be, it should not be held in a museum collection, is there a duty to report that in some way, or can you advise the collector about how to deal with that?
It's really important to make the point that we hold museums and the private collectors to very different standards. So for the museum sector, there are certain codes of ethics in place that say that you shouldn't acquire certain materials. That doesn't mean that as a private collector you cannot acquire them. So there's no illegality in play there. It's just something that museums cannot acquire there. Of course, if we find out, which we never have, that an object was stolen recently from, let's say, a country house somewhere, then of course we would report it to the police. If we discover that an item, for example, has question marks over its Nazi-era provenance, then we would contact the relevant parties. And there's always the understanding that if this is revealed, we will do this. But it's really about new codes of ethics that have only emerged relatively recently. So if you look at, for example, the V&A established in the 1850s, for most of our history, we didn't have to ask any of these questions. Right? It only changed really recently in the late 90s with the Washington Principles, which put Nazi-looted art on the agenda of museums. And then in the early 2000s, when the UNESCO convention was implemented, which means that museums in England have to concern themselves with the export laws for cultural property of other countries. So this is something that then creates a lot of problems, as you can imagine, because for decades collectors collected without keeping paperwork. They had no reason to do so. And now we suddenly ask them all these questions. So what I would say is that if there are clear signs that an object is problematic, it will not come to the museum. But I think the reality is that there are many objects which have gaps in their provenance, but these gaps do not indicate that there's a problem necessarily. It just means that there's a gap. And even with a lot of research, it's sometimes not possible to close these gaps. And I think we can make a case that it's better that objects like this come to the museum, go on display, so that if a problem is later found, that we can work constructively with countries of origin, for example, to resolve this. But I think it's very important, because museums have not been honest about this in the past, it's very important to be honest how difficult this research is, and that you sometimes cannot find the answers because the documents were not created, because there was no reason to keep them, and for other reasons.
I think, thinking about the idea of mistakes, going back to that, of course, there are extreme examples which you don't want to do, whether that's provenance or authenticity. But for me as a dealer, and maybe this is different for a museum, and Megan might say the same thing from a client side, but I think making mistakes, that just happens. That's part and parcel of buying art. And as a dealer, I think mistakes are not necessarily a bad thing because they help you grow, whether that's you spent a little bit too much for something, or you bought something which is not quite good enough, or you buy something and your tastes change and it's no longer something which really excites you. So from a dealer, I've made those mistakes, and I sit here now being quite happy I made them, because that's allowed me to arrive to where I am and learn and to know more. So I think we want to definitely avoid the sorts of things that Jacques is talking about, because those are really quite major issues. But in a sort of more general term, I don't think mistakes, quote unquote, are necessarily a really bad thing early on in your collecting or dealing career.
Yeah.
Whether it's, you know, paying too much for something or buying something that isn't great, you know, private collectors can always deaccession things, or, you know, and they do, you know, they become more sophisticated, they let go of some things and,
Yes.
you know, deaccession and,
Yeah.
and buy something that's a little bit better.
These are some of my favorite stories from the chase when you encounter. I believe was it Eli Broad who started with kind of impressionism, or,
Right, exactly.
and then realized he was missing out on the art of his time, and of
Right.
course became one of our great contemporary dealers. Jacques, you touched on this a little bit, but to focus more around collectors, whether new or experienced, dealing with problems, or let's say perhaps. I'm part of a family and I've inherited some works that there's material lacking in the provenance, and I don't want to get in trouble. I didn't even acquire the work perhaps. I think my grandfather did in good faith. How do you go about filling that information in and getting to a point where you feel comfortable selling it or donating it? Or
That's a really, really interesting question, and there's a real problem, I think, that there are a lot of collections that were put together during a time when documents were not kept, and now people want to give them to museums, and museums say we can't accept this without paperwork. And what happens, they disappear in the art market and private collections, and they will probably never be on display in museums again. And also, if there's a problem, then these problems are not actually discovered and dealt with. Yes. Because private collections generally do not have to restitute items. So the question is, where do you start? I mean, there are generally two ways, right? You can start to trace the history from the point of creation through time.
Yeah.
Very, very difficult, but can also be very easy depending on the age of the object. Or you try to trace your way back in time, and you go to the person who the grandparents acquired the objects from. Thank you very much. You go to the person who the objects were acquired from, hope that they kept an archive, and then you try to work your way back in time. It is a research opportunity, and I think if this happened to me, I would frame it as a research question and try to see if I could get a PhD student interested in this. If there's a university that's interested in it, I would just. There's a sort of, nobody needs to feel ashamed because there's no paperwork that they inherited, right? But the question is, how do you deal with it constructively? And I think the best way is to think of it as a research question and to say, if this research reveals a problem, we will deal with this in a responsible manner.
And I wonder, have you encountered any sort of chilling effect around, I mean, because there are these new standards, something that I just worry about is, are we going to see less great art entering museums? Is there a fear? What you're doing, I think, is really important, Jacques, educating people, saying, do not be ashamed, right? I never heard this idea, great idea. Go to universities, do the research. But is there any fear in the field that there could be a chilling effect of work not getting donated, or work just kind of disappearing and staying in private collections, or is the message getting out about it?
I think it depends on the field. Obviously, the art market is such a broad field. Within that, there are subsectors and different domains. So some areas of the art market, provenance is becoming really integral. I mean, it's integral to everything, but in terms of you have to have an unbroken provenance going back 100 years in order for a museum to accept this. So for some areas, it's becoming more difficult, but for others, of course, modern art, for example, a lot of what I deal with the provenance is important, but it's not necessarily a make or break whether this can enter a museum. That's my experience anyway.
Yeah, yeah. Jacques, you talked about the kind of changes that have taken place with museums, and now the fact of reckoning with the Nazi-looted art that's in many collections throughout Europe, throughout the world. Of course, we're seeing with African art as well, a real reckoning with colonialism. I'm wondering if there are areas of collecting, because we've been speaking very generally, where you perhaps see other changes happening, things that collectors should be wary of, or things that you think are overblown.
I think it's very difficult to make these predictions, right? At the moment, the focus is firmly on Nazi-era provenance when it comes to problematic provenance, colonial-era provenance, but with a particular focus on Africa, and then, of course, objects that come from conflict regions and sort of archaeological items and so on. But I do not feel confident enough to predict what sort of the challenges going forward will be, because every time a museum curator has tried to do this, they failed. In the 1980s, the V&A tried to predict what the big challenges of the future would be, and they predicted all sorts of things, but the fact that after the Second World War, Nazi-looted art would become an issue again in the 1980s did not occur to them. They also predicted that restitution claims would come from countries, from certain countries, but they then eventually came from completely other countries, right? And it's really difficult to predict these trends, because when it comes to the colonial debate, in the 1970s it was incredibly intense, and in the 1980s. And then it became incredibly intense because of Macron's speech. It's very, very difficult to predict what the challenges are, but there is one continuum, and that is that more and more people are interested in the history of the object. And these are great stories. I'm not somebody who only likes to talk about problems. I think there's so much to gain when we talk about the people who owned, collected, and sold these items in the past. And visitors, at least in museums today, it's not enough to just put an object on display. They want to know the story, I think.
Yeah, no, what you're talking about, the humility is just so important, right? We just don't know. You know, we're trying to act in a way that is appropriate and ethical, but who knows what will happen. But what you just set up a perfect transition, which is I had asked all of the panelists also to just think about great stories of the thrill of the hunt, and think about whether historically material that has been acquired by great collectors or has entered museums like the V&A. So I would toss out, as we're rounding the bend toward the Q&A, if there are just stories that anyone would like to share about that.
Well, from my own perspective, I think there's one work which I found which really remains with me. It's not the most expensive work I found, it's not the most important, but it was a work I'd sort of been looking for a long time. So there's Jean-Léon Gérôme is an Orientalist artist, and in today's climate he's got a rather negative name because he does these quite often sexualized, exoticized depictions of the Near East. But he was also a fantastic portraitist, and he did a series of head studies of Egyptian cities. And some are known, some are in museums, but there's one, and I always knew it because there was engraving after it, and I'd always loved the engraving, and thought, gosh, there must be a study for this somewhere. And as I do, on my laptop, looking through auctions, in a very small French auction, suddenly I saw it, and immediately my heart stopped, because as I said, genuinely I'd been looking and thinking about this image for a long time. And it was a beautiful moment because not only did I find the drawing itself, but the drawing had an inscription which gave the city's name. She was called Ayush. It told us where she was from, Luxor. So it really added to the context of this lady's life, and we understand, okay, it's very scant biographical information, but we knew who she was, and for a picture of the mid-19th century, that's very rare in that context. So I think that's one thing that stands out for me, and I sold it to a private client, and it's something, I mean, the whole topic of dealers collecting, again, is another interesting topic to explore another day, but that's something I would love to get back and have myself.
Have you made an offer to get it back yet? Or
I need to make some more sales, Andrew, but
okay,
it's in my mind. When I've done this sale, that sale, I'll go back to them. Yeah.
I get shivers hearing stories like that. I love it. Megan, how about you? Are there particular?
Yeah, I mean, there are so many stories, and we could be here for the rest of the day. But I thought of two stories in response to your question, sort of two different behaviors, because they really parallel. So one was an older collector that I've been working with, and he always talked about the one that got away, right? And almost every collector has like, oh, that thing I should have bought, that thing I couldn't get, somebody else got it. And for him, he was a great collector of American paintings. It was a Bierstadt that he wanted more than anything. And it was a very, very significant picture. He knew where it was in a private collection. He said, tried to make nice all the time. If you ever decide to sell it, come to me. And so finally a dealer did come to him and gave him the opportunity to sell it. To buy it, excuse me. The family was selling it, and if he didn't buy it, it was going to go to auction. And he was just told me, he was all excited, he was ready to go, and they told him the price, and he just thought it was wrong. And it went to auction, and it went for about 40% more than what I know. Just the worst story. 40% more than he could have bought it for, and he didn't buy it. Oh. And so he still, would always talk about the one that got away. And then a happier story, a client, the same thing, really, really wanted a Monet from a specific period, a specific type. We did the research, what works are out there in private hands, what can you never touch because it's at a museum. And again, we did the same research. We put ourselves in a position of, if that ever comes up, would you please call us? And he got the opportunity, and he acted, and he got it. And the difference between the two stories really has to do with not the chase or the desire or the means to buy. I think it has to do with the preparation and the homework.
Yeah.
And really being prepared for what is the price that I need to pay for this thing, and am I, when the time comes, going to be willing to pay it?
Wow. Yeah. The full spectrum of emotions in those two.
Exactly.
Wow.
So it's so much about, it's about the provenance research. It's about the research into the quality. It's understanding the condition of the painting. It's also understanding the market at that moment. So you're ready to act.
Yeah.
Because you don't have a lot of time.
And then you must act.
You got to go.
Wow.
Yeah.
I love that. And Jacques, how about you? I mean, you have just incredible collections you're working with.
Yes, and I, if you don't mind, I would like to bring this back to one of the topics that you raised earlier about the chilling effect and the anxiety surrounding this, that we sometimes do not know what we put in the collections. And I worked for a private collection that contained an ancient gold vessel, and research revealed that this vessel was illegally exported from Turkey. And now the question was, how do you deal with this? And I think that's something that collectors who collect this type of material should think about early on. And in this particular case, it was possible to turn this problem into something that was both good for the object, because the object was restituted, but it was also good for the collection, because the object is now on display in the Museum of Anatolian Civilizations in Ankara with a label that celebrates the collector, Arthur Gilbert. And a modern art piece was commissioned in response to this story, which is now on display at the V&A. So I think it's really important to always keep in mind, what do you do if there is a problem, and how do you do it in a way that's sort of good for everyone involved in the process.
So something really, positive grew out of this,
right.
that you take it, and that's wonderful. Well, I've received a sign from the audience that we're just about to the Q&A time. So rather than toss another question to the panelists, I'll just ask all of you to first give them a round of applause and thank them for